Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Riker, and today, I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now, because what I am about to share with you is something that has kept me awake for 3 nights straight. I found something that was not supposed to be found, and before this video gets taken down, or before I lose the courage to tell you all of this, I need you to hear every single word I am about to say. You see, there's a place on this earth so deep, so dark, so cold, that even our most advanced technology has only scratched its surface. And what lives down there, what has been recorded down there, what has been heard coming from down there, will change the way you look at the ocean forever. The last researcher who went looking for answers to what I am about to tell you was found floating 3 miles from his research vessel. His equipment was destroyed, his logbook was missing, and the last entry in his digital recorder said only 4 words. It is still down there. Stay with me, because this story gets darker the deeper we go. Before I begin this story, I can already see that almost 80% of my viewers right now are watching without subscribing, and that really breaks my heart because I put so much time and research and sleepless nights into bringing you these stories. So please right now hit that subscribe button, smash that like button, and click the bell icon so you never miss a single story from this channel. I love this community so much, and I want to keep growing it with people like you. Also, from where are you watching this video right now? I love to know. Drop your city or your country in the comment section right now. And tell me what time it is where you are morning night. Are you watching this alone in the dark? Because if you are, you might want to turn a light on before we continue. And if you have your own mysterious or horror story that you want to share with the world, you can email us or drop it in the comments below. We read every single one, and your story might just be the next one featured on this channel. Now let us begin. It started with a man named Orion. Orion was not the kind of person who scared easily. He had grown up near the coast of Sydney, Australia, where the ocean was not just a backdrop to life, but the very heartbeat of everything around him. As a child, he would sit at the edge of the cliffs overlooking the Tasman Sea and watch the waves crash against the rocks below with a kind of hunger that other children found strange. His mother, Naira, a marine biologist who had dedicated her entire career to studying deep-sea ecosystems, would tell him that the ocean was a living thing, a breathing entity with its own moods and memories. Orion grew up believing her. By the time he was 34 years old, Orion had become one of the most respected deep-sea researchers in the Southern Hemisphere. He had dived in the Great Barrier Reef, mapped sections of underwater mountain ranges in the Southern Ocean, and had even participated in a joint expedition with European researchers off the coast of Norway to study deep-sea thermal vents. He had seen things most people only read about in textbooks, bioluminescent creatures that looked like something out of a fever dream. Fish with transparent bodies, so thin you could see their organs pulsing. Geological formations on the ocean floor that defied every textbook explanation he had ever been taught. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what was waiting for him at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The Mariana Trench, for those of you who do not know, is the deepest place on the face of this earth. It sits in the western Pacific Ocean, east of the Mariana Islands, and it plunges down to a depth of approximately 11 kilometers below the surface. 11 kilometers. Let that sink in for a moment. If you took Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on land, and dropped it into the Mariana Trench, its peak would still be more than 2 kilometers beneath the surface of the water. That is how deep we are talking about. And here is the terrifying part. We know more about the surface of Mars than we do about the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Only 3 humans in all of recorded history had ever reached the very deepest point of the trench, a place called Challenger Deep, and what they reported seeing down there was never fully released to the public. Orion knew all of this. He had memorized every documented descent, every recorded anomaly, every unexplained sonar reading that had ever been pulled from those black waters. And he had spent the last 6 years of his life building a case, gathering evidence, writing proposals, fighting for funding, all so that he could lead the first truly comprehensive manned expedition to Challenger Deep. When the funding finally came through, it came from an unlikely source, a private research organization based in Zurich, Switzerland, called the Deep Sight Foundation, reached out to Orion through a mutual contact at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where Orion had been teaching and conducting research for the past 4 years. The contact was a quiet man named Daxon, a data analyst who worked part-time for the university and part-time for organizations Orion had never heard of. Daxon was not a man who smiled much. He was tall and thin with pale eyes that seemed to process everything around him like a machine scanning its environment. He had shown up at Orion's office one Tuesday afternoon without an appointment, set a manila folder on the desk, and said simply, "They want to fund your expedition, all of it, but there are conditions." Orion had opened the folder. Inside was a budget proposal that made his hands shake. It was more money than his department received in an entire decade. It was enough to build a custom submersible, hire the best crew in the world, and run the expedition for 6 full months, without any financial pressure. The conditions were unusual, but not immediately alarming. The DeepSight Foundation wanted full access to all data collected during the expedition. They wanted a dedicated encrypted feed of all audio and video recorded during the dives. And they wanted one of their own people on board the research vessel at all times. Orion had hesitated. Daxon had slid a second document across the desk. It was a non-disclosure agreement, 47 pages long. Something in the back of Orion's mind had whispered to him in that moment. Something quiet and cold, like the distant sound of deep water moving in the dark. But the pull of Challenger Deep was stronger than caution. It had always been stronger than caution. He signed the agreement, and that, as Orion would later tell the few people he trusted enough to speak to after everything that happened, was where the story truly began. The research vessel was called the Abyssal Crown. It was a custom-built oceanographic ship, 212 feet long, equipped with the most advanced sonar systems available, a pressurized submersible bay, an onboard laboratory that would have made most university research departments weep with envy, and crew quarters for 14 people. The team Orion assembled was extraordinary. There was Calix, a former Royal Navy deep-sea diver from Portsmouth, in England, who had spent 15 years working on classified underwater salvage operations. He was broad-shouldered and quiet, with a habit of speaking in short, precise sentences that made everything he said feel more serious than it might have coming from anyone else. Calix had seen things in the water that he never talked about, not because he had signed agreements, but because he simply believed there were things the human mind was not designed to process out loud. There was Xavier, an acoustic scientist from Montreal, who had spent the last 8 years analyzing deep-sea sounds for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Xavier was the kind of person who could hear a recording of deep-sea audio and identify not just what was making the sound, but roughly where in the water column it was coming from and how far away it was. He was warm and enthusiastic, the kind of person who laughed easily and made everyone around him feel calmer. But in the days leading up to departure, Orion noticed that Xavier had grown quieter than usual. He would sit for long stretches in the ship's audio lab with his headphones on, staring at waveform displays on his monitor, not moving. When Orion asked him once what he was listening to, Xavier had taken off his headphones, looked at Orion for a long moment, and said, "Something is already down there making noise. I picked it up in the pre-expedition sonar sweep, and Orion. It does not match anything in the database." Then there was Maren. She was a marine biologist from Oslo in Norway who specialized in deep-sea creature behavior and had published papers on organisms found below 5,000 meters that had challenged the established understanding of what life could survive under extreme pressure. She was sharp and direct with a dark sense of humor that surfaced in the most unexpected moments and somehow always made the tension easier to carry. And finally, the person nobody on the team had chosen, the person Orion had been obligated to include as part of his agreement with the DeepSight Foundation. Her name was Vesper. Vesper was introduced to the crew as a data management specialist. She was calm in a way that felt almost architectural, like calmness was not a mood she was in, but a structure she had been built inside of. She was polite to everyone, helpful when needed, and completely impenetrable. No one could draw her into real conversation. No one could find out where she had worked before, what she had studied, or why someone with her specific skill set had been assigned to a deep-sea research expedition. Orion tried twice in the first week at sea to have a genuine conversation with Vesper. Both times she answered his questions cleanly and completely, and then somehow redirected the conversation back to logistics or data management, without ever being rude, without ever making him feel like she was avoiding him, and yet somehow leaving him with absolutely no new information about who she actually was. Calyx had pulled Orion aside after the second conversation and said quietly, "Watch her. I have worked with government liaisons before, and she moves like someone who has been trained to take up as little space as possible until the moment she needs to take up a lot of it." The Abyssal Crown departed from Sydney Harbor on a gray morning in late autumn. The sky was the color of old iron, and the Tasman SA was already restless as they moved out of the harbor. Orion stood at the bow and watched Australia disappear behind them and felt something that he could not immediately name. It was not excitement exactly. It was heavier than excitement. It sat lower in the chest. It was the feeling of crossing a threshold that only moves in one direction. The journey to the Pacific Ocean took 11 days. During those 11 days, 3 things happened that Orion would later identify as the first warnings. The first was the sound. Xavian had been running continuous passive acoustic monitoring since they departed, recording the soundscape of the water beneath them as they moved. It was standard practice on a deep-sea research vessel, a way of documenting what the ocean was doing acoustically before you arrived at your target location. But on the 4th night at sea, Xavian came to Orion's cabin at 2 in the morning and knocked on the door with the specific cadence of someone who is trying to sound calm while not being calm at all. Orion opened the door. Xavian was standing in the corridor with his laptop, his face lit from below by the screen, and he looked like he had not slept. He turned the laptop so Orion could see the waveform display. There was a sound pattern on the screen that did not belong to anything Orion recognized. It was not whale song. It was not the sound of geological activity. It was not any known biological or mechanical source. It was a low-frequency pulse, regular, rhythmic, and it was getting louder as they moved north toward the Pacific. Xavian said, "Whatever this is, it started as background noise 4 days ago, and it has been growing steadily since we departed Sydney. I have run it against every database I have access to. It does not match the bloop. It does not match any recorded sound event in the deep-sea acoustic library. Orion, this is something new." Orion had asked the question that was already sitting in his throat. How deep is it coming from? Xavian had looked at him, paused, and said, "My best estimate based on a propagation model is somewhere between 8 and 11 kilometers. Challenger Deep was 11 kilometers deep. The second warning came on the 7th day. One of the crew members, a navigation technician named Cayley's, who had joined the expedition through a posting at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, came to Orion during dinner looking pale and uncomfortable. She sat down across from him and lowered her voice and said that she had been reviewing satellite imagery of their destination coordinates as part of standard pre-arrival mapping, and she had found something in the imagery from 18 months ago that she could not explain. She slid her tablet across the table to Orion. On the screen was a satellite image of the surface of the Pacific Ocean directly above Challenger Deep, and in the center of the image there was a circular disturbance in the water, a perfect circle approximately 400 meters in diameter where the surface of the ocean was wrong. The color was different, a deep greenish-black against the surrounding blue, and the wave patterns around the circle moved in a way that suggested something below the surface was disturbing the water from an extraordinary depth. Orion had stared at the image for a long time. Cayley's had said, "I checked the date on the imagery. That disturbance appeared on the surface, and then 2 days later, it was gone. No storm, no geological event recorded in the area at that time, no ship traffic, nothing to explain it." Orion had shown the image to Mariana, who had studied it in silence for several minutes before saying very quietly, "That color, that specific greenish-black discoloration of the surface water, I have only ever seen it associated with a mass die-off event, when something very large dies at depth and the decomposition gases rise to the surface. But to create a disturbance 400 meters across, whatever died would have to be." She had stopped herself. Orion had waited. Mariana had finished the sentence in barely a whisper. "Would have to be bigger than anything we have ever cataloged in the ocean." The third warning was the dream. On the 9th night at sea, Orion woke at 4 in the morning from the deepest sleep he had ever experienced. Not a restless sleep, but a sleep so complete and so dark that waking from it felt like being pulled upward through water. He lay in his bunk for several minutes, staring at the ceiling of his cabin, breathing hard, his heart rate elevated, and the details of the dream fading at the edges the way deep-sea images fade when you bring them to the surface. But the core of the dream remained. He had been underwater, not in a submersible, but actually in the water, hovering in complete darkness thousands of meters below the surface. And below him, further down than his mind could process, there was a light, not the bioluminescent blue of deep-sea creatures, but something warmer, amber-colored, pulsing with that same rhythm he had heard in Xavier's waveform display. And as he had drifted toward the light, without choosing to, he had heard a voice, not in his ears, but inside his skull, low and resonant, and speaking in a language he did not recognize, but somehow understood at the level of sensation rather than comprehension. And what the voice had communicated was not words exactly. It was a warning. Stay back. Orion had lain in his bunk until dawn, thinking about a story his mother Naira had told him when he was 12 years old. She had come home from a deep-sea dive near the drop OFF at the edge of the continental shelf outside Sydney, and she had sat him down at the kitchen table and said, "Orion, I need you to understand something about the ocean that they do not teach in schools. The ocean is not empty space filled with water and creatures. The ocean is a system with a memory, and there are parts of it so old and so deep that they remember things that existed before human beings were a thought on this planet." He had asked her what she meant. She had looked at him with those eyes that always seemed to be calculating more than they were showing, and said, "I mean that the deep ocean is not waiting to be explored. It is waiting to be left alone." He had never asked her about it again, and now as the abyssal crown moved through the pre-dawn Pacific, cutting toward coordinates that represented the deepest point on the planet, he understood for the first time that his mother had not been speaking philosophically. She had been telling him something true. They arrived at the coordinates for Challenger Deep on the 12th day. The surface of the Pacific was deceptively calm, shimmering flat under a pale morning sky, as if the ocean were sleeping, as if nothing unusual existed beneath its surface. But Xavier's acoustic monitors were screaming. The pulsing sound they had been tracking for 8 days had grown so strong that it was now audible through the ship's hull, not as a sound exactly, but as a vibration. A deep subsonic trembling that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. The entire crew had noticed it by breakfast that morning. They had all been quieter than usual, moving through the ship's corridors with that particular kind of deliberateness that people adopt when they are unsure whether the environment they are in has become dangerous. Vesper had appeared on deck at sunrise, standing at the rail looking down at the water with an expression that Orion could not read. She had her tablet under her arm, and she was recording something. Not data from the ship's systems, something she had brought herself. A small personal device that Orion had not seen before. When Orion had approached her and asked what she was recording, she had smiled, not warmly but correctly, and said, "Baseline readings for the Foundation. Standard protocol." Nothing about this felt like standard protocol. The first reconnaissance dive was scheduled for the following morning. Orion and Calyx would descend in the Abyssal Crown submersible, a vessel called Deep Herald, to a depth of 6,000 meters, well above Challenger Deep, but deep enough to gather data on the water column and test all systems before the full descent. That night Orion could not sleep. He sat in the ship's audio lab with Xavier after midnight, both of them listening through headphones to the sound coming from below, and now that they were directly above the source, the nature of the sound had become clearer and far more unsettling, because it was not a uniform pulse anymore. It was varying. Xavier had slowed the playback to half speed and shown Orion the waveform on his monitor, and in the valleys and peaks of the sound, in the subtle modulations of its rhythm, there was structure, there was repetition with variation, there was the kind of pattern that in any other context, in any acoustic analysis of sound above the surface of the earth, would immediately suggest one thing, and one thing only: communication. Xavier had said it without looking up from his monitor, voice completely flat. I have been sitting on this for 3 days because I did not want to say it out loud, but this pattern has a grammar to it. I cannot decode it. I do not have the framework, but the statistical probability that this level of structured variation in the repeating acoustic signal is random is essentially zero. Orion had stared at the waveform for a very long time. Then he had said, "How long has this been going on? I mean, how long before we picked it up?" Xavier had turned to look at him then, and something in his face had shifted, something that Orion did not want to see in the face of a man who had spent years listening to the darkest parts of the ocean. He said, "I traced the signal backward through archive recordings from research buoys in this region. Orion, this signal has been present in the acoustic record for at least 60 years. Nobody was looking for it. 60 years. The first dive in Deep Herald the following morning was on the surface routine. Orion and Calyx descended through the upper water column in silence, watching the sunlit blue of the shallower water gradually deepen to a turquoise, then to a dark blue, then to a blue so dark it was nearly indistinguishable from black. The pressure gauge climbed steadily as they descended. The temperature dropped. The world outside the viewport shrank to a narrow cone of light from the submersible's forward floods. At 3,000 meters the ocean floor was still far below them, but already the world had become alien enough to feel like they had left the planet entirely. Bioluminescent organisms drifted past the viewport like slow falling stars, organisms that Marin, monitoring the dive feed from the ship, called out by name over the comms with quiet reverence. Jellyfish trailing 20-meter curtains of luminous tentacles, anglerfish hanging in the dark with their horrifying lures, swaying gently, creatures that had never evolved to be seen, and yet glowed with their own cold fire regardless. At 4,000 meters, something happened that was not in the plan. Calyx was monitoring the exterior cameras, while Orion handled the navigation console, and Calyx had gone very still. Orion noticed the stillness in his peripheral vision before he noticed anything else. Calyx had the particular kind of stillness that combat-trained people have when they have identified something and are taking time to assess it before reacting. Orion had looked at the camera monitor that Calyx was watching. On the starboard exterior camera, in the edge of the light cone, something was moving. Not drifting, not floating. Moving. It was large. Orion could tell that much immediately even without a scale reference, because the movement itself had a mass to it, a suggestion of significant physical size in the way the water displaced around it. But it was moving at the very edge of the light, deliberately it seemed, staying just at the boundary between illuminated and dark, visible enough to perceive, but not enough to identify. Calyx had said very quietly over the internal comm, "Orion, what is that?" Orion had increased the forward flood intensity by 40%. The thing at the edge of the light had moved back, precisely tracking the new light boundary, retreating just far enough to remain invisible. It did not flee. It adjusted. Orion had felt something then that he had not felt in 20 years of ocean research. He had felt genuinely afraid. Not the manageable excitement of encountering something unknown, not the productive anxiety of a risky dive, but the specific cold fear of realizing that something in your environment is aware of you and is behaving strategically in response to that awareness. He had said over the comms to the Abyssal Crown, "We have a contact at 4,000 meters on the starboard camera. Something large, unidentified, actively tracking the light boundary. We are not pursuing. We are proceeding with scheduled dive parameters." Marin's voice had come back immediately. "How large?" "Best estimate." Calyx had answered before Orion could. He had said 3 words in that flat, precise voice of his that left no room for dramatic interpretation. Very, very large. They had ascended to the surface without further incident, but the thing at the edge of the light had remained with them for 2 full kilometers of ascent, always staying at the boundary, always adjusting, always present, until at some point Orion could not identify precisely. It was simply no longer there. Back on Abyssal Crown, the debrief was the most intense professional conversation Orion had ever participated in. Marin had reviewed the camera footage 17 times. She had measured the shadow and displacement patterns in the water around the contact. She had cross-referenced the apparent movement speed with known large pelagic animals. She had done everything methodical and scientific that a marine biologist of her caliber was trained to do. And at the end of 2 hours of analysis, she had put down her tablet, looked at Orion, and said, I cannot identify it. The displacement pattern suggests a body mass significantly larger than any known deep-sea creature. The behavior, the light tracking, the sustained parallel movement without apparent threat or prey response. I have never seen it in any species documentation. This is not a giant squid. This is not an oarfish. This is not any whale species. Orion. This is something that is not in our taxonomy. The room had been very quiet after she said that. Vesper had been sitting in the corner of the debriefing room throughout the entire conversation, not speaking, watching, making occasional notes on her personal device. When the silence had stretched out long enough to become uncomfortable, she had looked up and said simply, "The Foundation anticipated the possibility of unknown large fauna contact at depth. This does not change the expedition parameters." Everyone had turned to look at her. Calyx had said, "What do you mean the Foundation anticipated it?" Vesper had smiled that correct smile and said, "I mean that this region has produced anomalous biological contact reports before. The Foundation has been monitoring the data. It is why they funded this expedition." Orion had felt the ground shift under him, metaphorically, because the floor of the abyssal crown was very steady. He had looked at Vesper and said carefully, "They did not fund this expedition to advance deep-sea research." Vesper had said nothing. Orion said, "They funded it because they already know something is down there." Vesper had held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at her personal device. And that silence was the loudest answer Orion had ever received. That night the Pacific Ocean did something that the meteorological data had not predicted. The surface, which had been calm since their arrival, erupted into a violent storm that came from nowhere. No pressure drop on the instruments, no cloud formation in the preceding hours. The storm was simply suddenly there, 30-foot swells slamming against the hull of the abyssal crown with a rhythmic violence that suggested, to Orion's now hypersensitive perception, that the rhythm of the waves matched the rhythm of the acoustic signal Xavian had been monitoring. He knew that was not scientifically defensible. He thought it anyway. The storm lasted 9 hours. During those 9 hours, the acoustic signal from below Challenger Deep changed in a way that Xavian would spend the rest of the night documenting with shaking hands. The signal, which had maintained its steady pulsing rhythm for weeks, suddenly accelerated, pattern compressed. The amplitude increased by 40%, and for approximately 6 minutes in the middle of the storm's peak intensity, the signal stopped entirely. 6 minutes of complete acoustic silence from Challenger Deep, and then it came back. But it was different. Xavian came to Orion's cabin at 7 in the morning after the storm had broken, the sea now glassy and silent as if nothing had happened. He sat down in the chair across from Orion's bunk and said, "The signal changed last night. The pattern is different. The rhythm is different. It is still structured. It still has that grammatical quality, but it is accelerating. Like something that has been patient for a very long time, just suddenly became less patient." Orion had said, "Or like something that knows we are here." Xavian had not answered that. The full descent to Challenger Deep was scheduled for 3 days later. In those 3 days, 4 things happened that Orion would later describe as the point at which the expedition stopped being a scientific mission and became something else entirely. The first was the discovery Cayley's made in the satellite archive. She had been continuing to review historical imagery of the Challenger Deep coordinates, going further back than her initial search, and she had found a pattern. The circular surface disturbance she had shown Orion on his tablet was not a single event. It had occurred 9 times over the past 40 years, at irregular intervals, but always above the same coordinates, always approximately 400 meters in diameter, always lasting between 2 and 5 days before disappearing, and always, she showed Orion, with a line graph that made his stomach drop, always occurring in the weeks preceding a major unexplained disappearance event in the Pacific Ocean. She listed them for him. A Japanese research vessel in 1987, found adrift with no crew, no signs of struggle, no explanation in the official record. A New Zealand fishing trawler in 1994, vanished with 7 crew, wreckage found but no bodies. A privately funded deep-sea research expedition in 2003, an American team operating out of Honolulu. The vessel found grounded on an uninhabited island 300 miles from their last known coordinates, completely empty, All research equipment destroyed beyond recovery. A French oceanographic survey team in 2011. Last contact received while operating directly above Challenger Deep. Vessel found 6 weeks later in remarkably good condition. Absolutely no trace of the 11-person crew. Kaylee's had said, and the surface disturbance appeared in the satellite record in the weeks before every single one of these disappearances. Orion had looked at the current satellite data she had pulled that morning. The circular disturbance had appeared 2 days after their arrival. The second thing was what Mariana found in the biological samples from the first dive. The water samples collected during their descent to 4,000 meters contained organisms that Mariana had never seen in any deep-sea sample collection. She had identified several known species as expected, but mixed in with them were biological traces that did not correspond to anything in the taxonomic database she carried. Cellular structures that under the microscope looked wrong, not defective, not mutated, but designed differently, as if the fundamental architecture of life had made different decisions at some very early evolutionary branching point and arrived at a parallel solution. She had called Orion to the lab and shown him the slides without saying a word first. He had looked at what she was showing him for a very long time. Then he had said, "How old are these organisms?" Mariana had said, "That is the other thing. I ran carbon dating analysis on the organic material, and the results came back showing biological material in this sample that is Orion, that is older than any known deep-sea ecosystem. We are talking about organisms with the cellular age signature that suggests origins in the Precambrian period. The Cambrian period ended over 500 million years ago." The third thing was what happened to Calyx. He had been conducting a routine exterior inspection of the Deep Herald submersible, checking the hull integrity after the storm, and he had found something attached to the exterior of the vehicle that should not have been there. Not equipment, not debris, not anything mechanical. It was biological. A cluster of material approximately the size of a human palm adhered to the port side hull just below the waterline, gelatinous and translucent and faintly bioluminescent even in daylight. Calyx had photographed it before removing it and brought it to Mariana in a sample container. Mariana had examined it and gone very quiet for a very long time. When she finally spoke, she had said, "This is not from the first dive. This was deposited after the storm, while the submersible was in the water at surface level. Something came to the surface at night and left this on the hull." Calyx had asked what it was. Mariana had said, "I do not know what organism produced it, but the function of this material, based on its cellular structure, appears to be sensory. It is not adhesive in a mechanical sense. It is adhesive in a biological sense, like a receptor. Something left this here because it wanted to know more about what this object was." The fourth thing was Vesper. She had received a transmission from the Deep Sight Foundation on the second night after the storm. Orion knew this because Calyx had noticed the encrypted signal going out on the ship's communications array at 3 in the morning and had logged it. The transmission had lasted 40 minutes, considerably longer than any routine data transfer would require. When Orion had confronted Vesper about it the following morning, she had not denied it. She had said she was required to maintain regular contact with the Foundation and that the content of those communications was covered under the non-disclosure agreement Orion had signed. Orion had said, "Vesper, people have disappeared in this location, research teams, entire ships of people, and I am sitting on top of whatever caused that, and you are having 40-minute private conversations with the organization that put us here, and you knew about the disappearances before we arrived, and I need you to tell me right now what the Foundation actually knows about what is in that trench." Vesper had looked at him for a longer time than she had ever maintained eye contact with anyone on the ship. Then she had said, "I am going to tell you something that is not covered in the briefing materials, because I think you need to know it, and because I think you are going to go down there regardless of what I tell you. The Foundation has been monitoring this location for 31 years. They have acoustic data going back further than the archive recordings Xavier found. They have biological samples from previous expeditions. They have partial records from some of the expeditions that did not return, recovered from equipment that washed up later." Orion had held himself very still. Vesper had said, "The Foundation does not fully understand what is in the trench. That is the truth. but they know enough to know that it is old, vastly older than any known deep-sea ecosystem. They know it is aware of surface presence. They know it has responded to previous expeditions with what can only be described as curiosity. And they know that at some point in the last 30 years, the level of that curiosity has been increasing. Orion had said, "What do they think it is?" Vesper had paused. She said, "The working hypothesis is that the trench ecosystem is not simply a collection of evolved organisms adapted to extreme depth. The working hypothesis is that what lives in Challenger Deep represents an intelligence, not human in any sense, not structured in any way our models of consciousness can accommodate, but an intelligence nonetheless, one that has been present on this planet since before the first complex life crawled out of the ocean, one that has been watching, from the deepest place available to it, for longer than our species has existed." The silence that followed that statement was the longest silence Orion had ever sat inside of. Then he had asked a question that had been building in him since the first night. He heard the acoustic signal. He said, "What happened to the people who disappeared?" Vesper had looked away from him for the first time. She said, "The partial records recovered from the 2003 American expedition. The equipment that washed up contained audio recordings. The recordings were of the team during their final dive, and the audio contained communications, not from the team, something responding to the team's sonar pings, responding in a way that was structured and intentional." Orion had said, "Were there voices in the recording?" Vesper had been very quiet. She said, "Not voices, but something that modulated in a frequency range of human speech, something that had learned to approximate based on prior acoustic exposure." Prior acoustic exposure, meaning it had heard human voices before. Orion had not been able to sleep that night. He had sat on deck under the Pacific sky and listened to the water and tried to organize what he knew and what he felt into something rational, something that fit inside the framework of the scientific mind he had spent his entire life building. He thought about Atlantis, the legend of a great civilization swallowed by the sea. And he thought about how every culture in human history had built stories about what lived in the deep ocean. The Kraken of Scandinavian sailors, enormous and ancient and capable of pulling entire ships beneath the surface. The sea serpents of medieval cartographers who wrote here be dragons at the edges of their maps. The great Leviathan of ancient texts, something so vast and so powerful that it existed at the boundary between the natural world and something beyond it. He thought about the bloop, the mysterious ultra-low-frequency sound recorded by NOAA hydrophones in 1997, a sound so powerful it was detected across the entire Pacific Ocean, a sound that the official explanation attributed to icequake activity, but whose frequency profile had always troubled the acoustic scientists who studied it, including Xavier, because it matched biological sound production profiles more closely than any geological event they had ever recorded. He thought about the Baltic SEA anomaly, discovered by Swedish divers in 2011, a circular formation on the floor of the Baltic SEA that sonar imaging showed to be approximately 60 meters in diameter, with features that suggested geometry too precise to be entirely geological, with a reported effect on electronic equipment that caused dive cameras and instruments to malfunction when in close proximity, an anomaly that remained officially unexplained. He thought about the Bermuda Triangle, that stretch of the Atlantic Ocean between Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, where ships and aircraft had been disappearing for centuries, and about the fact that the section of ocean floor beneath the Bermuda Triangle included some of the deepest trenches in the Atlantic. He thought about his mother Naira, sitting at the kitchen table in Sydney, telling him that the ocean remembered things. And then he made the decision that anyone who had ever truly loved the deep ocean would inevitably make when presented with the thing that the deep ocean had been hiding. He decided to go down. The descent in Deep Herald began at 6 in the morning. Orion and Calyx settled into the cramped interior of the submersible as the Abyssal Crown's crew lowered them into the water. The Pacific surface was completely calm, mirror-flat, as if an acknowledgement or anticipation. Xavier was on the acoustic monitoring station aboard the ship, relaying real-time data to their audio feed. Marin was on biological analysis, ready to process anything the exterior cameras captured. Kaylee's was on navigation tracking. And Vesper was in the communications room, Orion did not know who she was talking to. The descent began. Through the viewport, the world transitioned through its familiar stages, the turquoise of the shallower depths giving way to the profound blue of the mesopelagic zone, then the twilight of the bathopelagic, then the absolute darkness of the hadal zone. At 6,000 meters, Xavier's voice came through the comms. The signal is significantly stronger at your current depth. Orion, I am having trouble isolating it from the other acoustic data. It is filling the frequency range. Orion checked the external microphone feed on his console and heard it directly for the first time, not filtered through recording equipment or acoustic analysis software, but raw, the sound of whatever was producing that signal from the deepest place on Earth. It was extraordinary. It was layered. There were low frequencies at the bottom of it that Orion felt in his chest rather than heard, and above those were structure modulations that shifted and varied with a complexity that the word pattern did not come close to capturing. And above those, at the upper edge of perception, there were elements that sounded almost like something Orion refused to name to himself in that moment. Calix had heard it too. He had gone completely still in his seat. At 8,000 meters, something appeared on the forward camera, not at the edge of the light this time, directly in the light. It was not what Orion had expected. He could not have said what he had expected. But this was not it, because it was not large, or rather its largeness was not its most immediately striking quality. What struck Orion first was the luminescence, a deep amber glow, the same amber he had seen in his dream 9 nights earlier, emanating from something that occupied the center of the forward camera field. Calix said, Orion. Orion said, I see it. He increased the forward flood intensity, and the creature, or structure, or whatever it was, did not retreat this time. It held its position, and as the light increased, Orion could see it more clearly, and the seeing of it produced in him a feeling he had no name for, something beyond awe and beyond fear, something that lived on the other side of both of those things. It was organic. He was certain of that. The surface of it had texture and variation that no geological structure produced, but it was also geometric. There were angles in its form that suggested intention, repetitive structures that pattern recognition instinctively reached toward as design. It was roughly spherical in its overall shape, perhaps 4 meters in diameter, wrapped in a network of translucent filaments that extended outward in all directions and caught the submersible's light and refracted it into colors Orion could not name. And it was pulsing, with the same rhythm as the sound. Marin's voice came through the comms, barely above a whisper. Are you seeing what I am seeing on the camera feed? Orion said yes. Marin said, Orion, that is not a single organism. That is a colony. Those filaments are connecting individual organisms into a collective structure, and the light emission is being coordinated across the entire structure simultaneously. That requires, Orion, some form of collective signal processing. The sound in Orion's audio feed had changed again. It had been growing louder as they descended, but now it shifted in character, the structured pulsing giving way to something more fluid, more varied, the acoustic equivalent of a living thing shifting from a resting state to an active one. Then something happened that Orion had no framework for. The thing in the light, the pulsing amber colony, extended one of its translucent filaments toward the submersible. Slowly, with extreme deliberateness, not a mechanical motion, but a reaching motion, the kind of motion that has intention behind it. Calix said Orion's name. Orion did not respond because at that exact moment the audio feed in his headset changed. The acoustic signal that had been filling the frequency range dropped away to nothing, and in the silence that followed, in the submersible at 8,000 meters below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, a new sound began. It was in the frequency range of human speech. It was not words, not quite, but the structure of it was close enough to human vocalization that Orion's brain processed it as speech the way the brain sometimes processes the sound of wind or water as voices, except that this was not random or periodolic. This was structured. This was intentional. This was something that had heard enough human acoustic output over enough decades to understand how human communication was shaped and was now attempting to use that shape. Calix said in a voice completely stripped of effect, It is trying to talk to us. The filament had stopped moving. It was extended toward the submersible, the tip of it approximately 1 meter from the hull, and the amber light of the colony was pulsing with the rhythm of the sounds filling Orion's headset. Orion's hands were on controls. He could ascend. He could turn the submersible and begin the climb back to the surface. Every trained response he had was telling him to do exactly that, but he did not, because in 34 years of loving the ocean, in a life spent pushing toward the unknown edges of what human beings understood about the world beneath the water, in all of it, he had never been this close to something genuinely new. He had never been this close to something that wanted to communicate. He reached forward and activated the submersible's external speaker, the system designed to broadcast sonar pings and acoustic markers for navigation purposes. He looked at Calyx. Calyx met his gaze, and after a moment nodded, one short downward motion. Orion pressed the broadcast button and spoke into the microphone. He said, "We hear you." The response was immediate. The amber colony blazed, every filament lit simultaneously at full intensity, and the sound that came back through the external microphone was nothing like the quasi-speech that had preceded it. It was a full-spectrum acoustic event so complex and so layered that Orion's headset automatically clipped it to protect his hearing, and even through the clipping it was the most extraordinary sound he had ever heard in his life. Xavian's voice came through the comms from the ship, completely undone, barely managing professional coherence. "Orion, the signal just went to full spectrum. I am reading acoustic output up here that is off every scale I have. What happened down there? What did you do?" Orion said, "We made contact." The silence on the ship comms lasted 3 full seconds. Then Marin said, "Oh my God." What followed was 3 hours. 3 hours during which Orion and Calyx sat in the deep Herald at 8,000 meters and participated in something that neither of them would ever fully be able to describe or explain. The colony, the intelligence, whatever it was, engaged them in an exchange that operated simultaneously on acoustic and light frequency levels. The filaments moved in patterns that Orion's visual cortex processed as language, even though they were not language in any human sense. The sounds it produced evolved over the course of the 3 hours, from the quasi-speech approximation of the opening minutes toward something increasingly complex and increasingly specific. By the second hour, Xavian was on the comms saying that the acoustic output had organized itself into recognizable mathematical ratios, prime number sequences, geometric progressions, the universal language of structured intelligence, regardless of its origin. By the third hour, something shifted in the character of the exchange that Orion could not quantify scientifically, but experienced unmistakably. It was asking them to go deeper, not in words, not in anything translatable, but in the way that the quality of the light and sound changed when Orion looked downward versus when he looked toward the surface, in the way the filaments extended toward the bottom of the visible range and pulsed with a particular urgency, in the way the acoustic pattern contained a directional quality that pointed down to Challenger Deep, down to whatever existed at the absolute bottom of the planet's deepest place. Calyx said quietly, "It wants us to follow it." Orion looked at the depth gauge. They were already deeper than the planned first full descent. They had enough power remaining in the submersible for another 3,000 meters of descent and a full return to surface. The structural integrity of Deep Herald had been certified to 11,000 meters under controlled conditions. He looked at the colony, the ancient glowing intelligence extending its invitation from the darkness of the Hadal Zone. He thought about his mother Naira, and the kitchen table, and the things she had said about the ocean waiting to be left alone. He thought about the research teams that had come here before and not returned. He thought about the 47 pages of the non-disclosure agreement, and about Vesper in the communications room, and about the Deep Sight Foundation, and about 31 years of monitoring, and about partial records recovered from expeditions that had ended in silence. Then Xavian's voice came through the comms, urgent, with the specific texture of controlled alarm. "Orion, we are picking up a second signal." "No, more than one, multiple signal sources, coming from deeper in the trench. They are responding to the first source. Orion, there are multiple intelligences down there responding to whatever you are in contact with right now. I am reading. I am counting at least 6 distinct acoustic signatures below you, and they're moving upward. Calyx met Orion's eyes. The decision they made in that moment was not scientifically defensible. It was not professionally justifiable. It was possibly the least rational response to the available information. They began their ascent, not because they were afraid, or not only because they were afraid, but because something in the quality of what was happening below them, some instinct that lived in a part of the brain older than rational thought, said clearly and without ambiguity, "This is not your depth." The ascent back to the surface took 3 hours. During those 3 hours, the acoustic signal from below followed them, not aggressively, not pursuing them with any apparent urgency, but present, always present, as if maintaining the connection it had established, as if making sure they knew it was still there. The colony they had made contact with did not follow them upward. Its amber light faded as they rose, and the last Orion saw of it through the viewport, it was slowly retracting its filaments and sinking back toward the bottom of the visible range, returning to the darkness it had lived in since before human beings walked upright on the land above. When deep peril broke the surface, and the crew of the Abyssal Crown pulled them from the water, Orion climbed out of the submersible and stood on the deck in the late afternoon light of the Pacific and felt the full weight of what had just happened settle onto him. Xavier met him at the submersible bay. He had printed waveform analysis from a 3-hour exchange, and he was holding the pages in both hands like they were something fragile. His face was the face of a man who had just had his fundamental understanding of the world permanently altered. He said, "Orion, I have been staring at this data for 3 hours, and I need you to know something. The acoustic patterns that emerged in the 3rd hour of the exchange, the mathematical structures, the organized sequences. I have run preliminary analysis, and the information density of those sequences is extraordinary. We did not just make contact down there. We were given information." Orion had said, "What kind of information?" Xavier had looked at the pages in his hands, and then back at Orion. He said, I think it was trying to show us a map." "A map of what?" Xavier said, "That is what I am still working on." "But Orion, the structures in the acoustic sequence, they correspond to spatial relationships, and the scale of the spatial relationships it encompasses the entire ocean floor. Every trench, every deep basin, every underwater mountain range on the planet. It was showing us a map of the entire ocean floor, and there were marks on it, places indicated with a specific repeating acoustic marker." Orion said, "How many places?" Xavier said 47. 47 points on a map of the ocean floor, spread across every ocean on the planet, all marked with the same acoustic indicator, all of them connected. Vesper appeared at the entrance to the submersible bay. She had her personal device in her hand, and she was looking at Orion with an expression that was the first genuinely unguarded thing he had seen from her since the expedition began. She said, "I have been in contact with the Foundation. They want the acoustic data from the descent immediately." Orion had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said no. Vesper had said, "Orion, this is covered by your agreement." Orion had said, "What they showed us down there, whatever it was, wherever those 47 points lead. I do not think the Foundation funded this expedition for research. I think they funded it because they are trying to find something, and they wanted us to make the contact they could not make themselves. And until I understand what they are planning to do with whatever we found, I am not sending them anything." Vesper had held his gaze for a long time. Then she had said something he had not expected at all. She had said, "You are right," and she had put her personal device in her pocket. That night the crew of the Abyssal Crown sat together in the ship's main cabin, and they talked for 6 hours, without stopping. They talked about what had happened and what it meant, and what it implied about the history of the planet, and the history of the ocean, and the history of life itself. They talked about what lived in the trench, not a single organism, but a collective intelligence, distributed and ancient and patient, waiting in the deepest available darkness for 60 years, or 600 years, or 6 million years. They could not know, communicating with itself across the world's ocean floor through 47 connected points, a global network that predated every human system by an incomprehensible margin. They talked about whether what they had encountered was dangerous, and they could not answer that, because the research teams that had not returned were evidence that it could be dangerous. But the exchange they had participated in was not threatening. It was reaching, Something that had been alone in the dark for longer than human civilization had existed, was reaching toward the first visitors it had encountered that it could communicate with. Mariana said, "Think about what it must experience when we come. Every expedition that reaches this depth is the equivalent of an alien visitation for something that has lived in complete isolation at the bottom of the planet. The disappearances, they may not have been intentional. They may have been the result of an intelligence trying to make contact with a technology and a physiology it did not fully understand, trying to communicate with tools it was still developing." Calyx said, "That is a generous interpretation." Mariana said, "It is the most accurate interpretation given the data." Xavier said quietly, "It has been getting better at it. The quasi-speech it produced in the first minutes of contact, the mathematical sequences in the third hour, it adapted in real time over 3 hours. Whatever cognitive processes it uses, they operate faster than anything we have a model for." Orion had sat and listened and felt in his chest the full size of what they were sitting on top of, not just in terms of scientific significance, but in terms of responsibility. Because here was the question that none of them had said aloud yet, but that was filling the room as surely as the acoustic signal had filled the Hadal Zone. What happens when the world finds out? Not the Deep Sight Foundation, not the academic community. The world. Every government, every military, every corporation, every interest on the surface of the planet that would look at 47 connected points on a global ocean floor map and see not an ancient intelligence, but a resource, technology, tactical advantage, threat. Orion thought about what human beings had done to every unknown thing they had ever encountered. He thought about what exploration had always eventually meant for the thing being explored. He thought about the ancient intelligence at the bottom of the Mariana Trench, patient and luminous and reaching toward the surface, with its amber light and its approximation of speech. And he thought about what would happen to it when the world above the water decided it had found something worth taking. He had stood up. He had said to the room, "We need to talk about what we're going to report." The discussion that followed was the hardest conversation of Orion's professional life. It was also the most important one. In the end, they made a decision that none of them had ever imagined making when they had boarded the Abyssal Crown in Sydney Harbor weeks earlier. They would report an unsuccessful expedition. Technical difficulties, equipment failure, inconclusive data, nothing of significance found. The kind of report that would satisfy the Foundation's data requirements under the agreement while giving them nothing useful. The kind of report that would send no alarm signals to any of the interests that would be immediately activated by the truth. Xavier's acoustic data, Mariana's biological samples, Calyx's satellite analysis, Calyx's camera footage from the descent. All of it would be preserved, documented completely, and held by each member of the team independently, protected and encrypted and in multiple locations. And the 47 points on a map of the ocean floor would remain unmarked on any document that left the Abyssal Crown. Vesper had listened to all of this without speaking. When Orion had finally turned to her and asked where she stood, she had been quiet for a long moment. Then she had said, "The Foundation will know the report is false. They have their own monitoring data. They will have detected the acoustic changes during your descent. They will know something happened." Orion had said, "I know." Vesper had said, "They will not let this go." Orion had said, "I know that too." A long pause. Vesper had said, "I joined the Foundation 7 years ago because I believed they were conducting legitimate deep ocean research in the public interest. 3 years ago I began to understand that the research was not the priority. The application of whatever the research found was the priority. I have been trying to find a way out of that understanding for 3 years." She paused. "I will help you protect the data." Calyx had said, "Why should we trust you?" Vesper had said, "Because I am the only person on this ship who actually knows what the Foundation is planning to do with whatever we found, and it is not something any of us should allow to happen." She had paused again. She said, "They want to communicate with it, on their terms. They have been developing a synthetic acoustic system designed to approximate the signal pattern and use it to direct the intelligence toward specific behaviors. They believe they can control it." The room had been very silent. Mariana had said quietly, "You cannot control something like that. You can barely communicate with it." Vesper had said, "I know." Orion had said. What would happen if they tried? Vesper had looked at the floor, then back at him, and said, based on everything the Foundation has modeled, if the intelligence at depth perceives an attempt at acoustic manipulation rather than genuine communication, the projected response is catastrophic, not targeted, not precise. The intelligence is distributed across 47 locations in every ocean on the planet. The projected response involves all 47 simultaneously. Nobody had asked what that meant in practical terms. Everyone in the room already understood what it meant. The Abyssal Crown turned south 3 days later and began the long journey back to Sydney. During those days, Orion spent hours sitting on deck watching the Pacific recede behind them and thinking about the things he could never say in any official report, about the amber light at 8,000 meters, about the ancient voice reaching toward the frequency of human speech, about the map of 47 connected points spread across the floor of every ocean the planet possessed, about a form of consciousness so old and so deep that the entire human timeline was a recent afternoon in its experience. He thought about his mother Naira. He was going to call her when he got back to land. He had not spoken to her in 3 months, and he suddenly felt very urgently that he needed to hear her voice, needed to tell her that she had been right about the ocean, in ways she had probably not even intended when she said it to a 12-year-old boy at a kitchen table in Sydney. He thought about what the world below the water had been doing while the world above it built its cities and fought its wars and told its stories about sea monsters and sunken civilizations. He thought about the Kraken of Norwegian legend, the ancient Scandinavian sailors who had navigated the North SEA and the North Atlantic in open wooden boats, and who had looked at the surface of the ocean and understood in their bones that something vast and old and aware lived beneath it, not as metaphor, not as superstition, but as knowledge passed down through generations of people close enough to the water to feel the truth of it. He thought about Atlantis, and about whether the legend of a great civilization swallowed by the sea was actually a legend at all, or whether it was a memory of something that had chosen the ocean rather than been consumed by it, something that had descended rather than sunk. He thought about the immortal jellyfish, Turritopsis dohrnii, the tiny organism discovered in the Mediterranean SAA that had the biological ability to reverse its aging process and return to its juvenile state indefinitely, an organism that in theory never had to die, and about what that implied for an ecosystem in the deepest part of the ocean where the evolutionary pressures were so extreme and so consistent over so many millions of years that life had arrived at solutions to its own limitations that surface biology had not even begun to approach. He thought about time, and about what it felt like to be that old. He thought about patience. On the last night before they reached Sydney, Orion sat alone on the bow of the Abyssal Crown and watched the southern stars and listened to the ocean moving beneath the hull, and he heard it very faint at the very edge of perception, whether through the hull or through some other pathway he could not identify. The pulse, still there, still rhythmic, still present, following them home, or not following them, simply persisting, the way it had persisted for longer than any human institution or civilization or species that had ever stood at the edge of the water and looked out. He listened to it for a long time, and then he spoke quietly into the night air over the ocean, not into any recording device, not for any scientific record, just to the water and to whatever lived in its deepest place. He said, "We will protect you." The pulse continued for a moment, and then, for just a moment, it changed. One single variation in the rhythm, a brief, complex modulation at the upper edge of what Orion could perceive, and then it returned to its steady ancient beat. Orion never published the findings from the expedition to Challenger Deep. The official report filed with the Deep Sight Foundation cited equipment failure at 4,000 meters and inconclusive data from the acoustic monitoring program. The Foundation made 3 attempts to contact Orion in the month following the expedition's return to Sydney. He did not respond to any of them. 6 months after the expedition, the Deep Sight Foundation dissolved, absorbed into another private organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, whose interests and motivations Orion could only speculate about. He did not speculate publicly. Calyx returned to Portsmouth and left the marine research industry entirely. He now teaches sailing to teenagers on the English Channel. He has never spoken publicly about the expedition. Xavier returned to Montreal and has been conducting research that he describes in academic papers as theoretical acoustic modeling for deep-sea communication systems. The papers are dense and technical and rarely cited, but those who read them carefully say they contain within their mathematics a framework for something unprecedented. Mariana published 2 papers on extreme depth biological samples in the months following the expedition, both focusing on previously unknown cellular structures in deep-sea organisms, both carefully worded to present findings without conclusions. She received 17 requests for raw sample data from institutions and organizations she had never heard of. She declined all 17. Kaylee's left academic research and now works for a private satellite imaging company in Edinburgh. She monitors the Pacific coordinates above Challenger Deep regularly through her professional access to commercial imaging satellites. The circular surface disturbance has not appeared since the expedition, but the waters above the trench are photographed and reviewed by commercial vessels and independent researchers with enough frequency that she would know quickly if anything changed. Vesper disappeared from any traceable record 4 months after the expedition returned to Sydney. Orion received 1 email from her on a date that happened to be the 1-year anniversary of their departure from Sydney Harbor. The email contained no text, only an attachment, a document with 47 GPS coordinates spread across the floors of every ocean on the planet. He printed it, folded it, and put it in the back of his desk drawer. He has not opened the drawer since, but he knows the coordinates are there, and he knows that somewhere at the bottom of 11 kilometers of dark Pacific water, in a place so deep and so cold and so pressured that the human body would be destroyed in seconds by the environment alone, something ancient and luminous and patient is still pulsing with its amber light, still communicating across its 47 connected points, still reaching upward toward the surface with its careful approximation of human speech, still waiting, not with urgency, not with impatience. It has been waiting since before the first human foot stepped onto the first shoreline. It can wait a little longer, and sometimes, on nights when the water is still and the southern stars are out, and the city of Sydney hums with the cheerful indifference of a civilization that does not know what shares the planet with it, Orion sits at the edge of the cliff above the Tasman SEA, where he sat as a child, and he listens, and in the deep subsonic register, below the sound of the waves, below the sound of the wind, below the sound of everything, he can still hear it. Pulse, pause, pulse, still there, still watching, still waiting. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. It truly means everything to me, because I know you could have clicked away at any moment, and you chose to stay, and that is something I do not take for granted for even a second. I want to know from you right now, in the comments below, what part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the moment of first contact at 8,000 meters? Was it the 47 points on the map? Was it the realization of what the Deep Sight Foundation was actually planning? Or was it that final pulse that Orion heard from the cliff above the Tasmanis? Tell me, because I genuinely want to know. And please tell me in the comments what topic you want to see next. Do you want more deep ocean mysteries? Do you want stories about unexplained disappearances? Do you want to go deeper into the legends of lost civilizations? Do you want to explore the real science behind the strangest sounds ever recorded on this planet? Your comments literally shape what this channel becomes, so please be heard. If you have not subscribed yet, please do it right now. It takes 2 seconds, and it means that the next time I spend weeks researching and building a story like this one, you will actually be there to see it. Hit the like button. Leave a comment, share this with someone who loves a good mystery. And if you have your own story, something that happened to you or someone you know that you cannot explain, something that has stayed with you, email us or drop it in the comments, because the best stories on this channel have come from the people watching it. Thank you for being here. Stay curious, stay brave, and never stop wondering what lives in the dark.